In 1880, in London, you could die. Not from a knife, not from disease, and not even from hunger. Sometimes from paper. They sold it secretly, not in shops, not on the streets. They passed it on in whispers, under the table, in dark alleys where the gas lamps shone just enough to see your face and remember it. One wrong look, one extra sheet in your pocket, and you're no longer a buyer, you're evidence. The police called it obscenity. The courts called it a threat to morality. And the London black market knew the truth. These papers were sold as if they were contraband that could kill you. Because sometimes they didn't come for money, but with a warrant, or without one at all. Today, we will go to a place where the printing press worked quieter than the heart, where illustrations were buried faster than bodies, and where there was only one question: could you survive it? This is not a horror story. This is history. When paper becomes a crime. There should be no abrupt transition after the last words of the teaser. Just a pause. One long second of silence. And then, London. Not the one shown in engravings. Not the one where shop windows shine and gentlemen adjust their hats. This is a different London. Lower, darker, closer to the ground. The year is 1880. The city is suffocating with people. More than 5 million bodies squeezed between brick, smoke, and fear. The air smells of coal, dampness, and horse sweat. During the day, this smell can still be ignored. At night, it enters the lungs, like a reminder. There is no place for the weak here. You walk down a narrow street where gas lamps are rarely seen. There is just enough light to see silhouettes, but not faces. This is not done by chance. It is not customary to look people in the eye here, because in your coat pocket is paper, folded in half, rough, cheap, and at the same time, more dangerous than a knife. In the 1880s, there was a clear rule in Britain. Some things are better not to have with you. Illegal alcoholic mixtures, contraband medicines, and printed materials that the state considers obscene. The word sounds soft, but behind it lies the reality. Arrest, trial, ruined lives. What we would call underground magazines today were then part of the black market for survival. They were not read openly. They were not discussed out loud. They were hidden, under the lining of a coat, in the false bottom of a suitcase, between the pages of the Bible, and that's no metaphor. Because in this city, paper can make you a criminal faster than any action. You stop at a shop that sells newspapers during the day. Ordinary, legal, with headlines about Parliament, war, the stock market. But it's late in the evening. The window is dark. The door is closed. You don't knock. You just wait. And if you wait too long, that too can be a problem. Because waiting is about getting attention. And attention in 1880 London is a dangerous thing. Finally, someone steps out of the shadows. Not abruptly, unhurriedly. You don't greet them. You don't name names. Your hands move faster than words. The money disappears. The paper appears. No one looks at the contents, because to look is to admit. You just know. What is in your pocket right now could ruin your life. At the same time, a few streets away, another person is reading a completely different set of papers. A police report. A list of addresses. Surnames. In the 1880s, The London police no longer just catch criminals. They hunt. Underground printing is the perfect target. Bloodless, noiseless, morally justified. We are protecting society, they say. We are protecting women, children, families. But in practice, that means raids, searches, confiscations, and very often, accidental victims. Because to fall under suspicion, it is enough to be in the wrong place and have the wrong paper. You return home. The room is cramped. The walls absorb the cold. You can hear your neighbors through the floorboards. You spread the paper on the table, slowly, as if it might explode. And at that moment, understanding comes. What is scary is not what is printed. What is scary is the very fact of possession. Because if there is a knock on the door right now, you will not be able to explain why you have it. You will not be able to prove that you did not sell. You will not be able to convince the court that you were just looking. In Victorian Britain, intention does not matter. Only presence matters. And the paper is silent. It does not protect. This is not a story about entertainment, and not a story about interesting pictures. This is a story about fear that can be folded and put in your pocket. About danger that doesn't scream, doesn't run. It just waits for someone to see. Because in 1880, the most dangerous thing in London is not a knife in a dark alley. It's a piece of paper that someone has decided is a crime. The machine that prints fear. If paper is a crime, then someone had to learn how to commit crimes in series. And it wasn't romantics who did it, not artists, and certainly not madmen. These were people who wanted to survive. Underground printing in 1880s London had no sign, no address, and almost never a permanent location. Printing houses appeared and disappeared like fog over the Thames. Today, in the basement behind the pub. Tomorrow, in the attic, where yesterday they were drying laundry. The day after tomorrow, in a room that looked like a coal warehouse during the day. The machine was never near a window, never facing the street, and almost always near the exit. Because when the police come in, the count is not in minutes, in seconds. A printing press is a loud machine, even a small one, even an old one. It knocks, creaks. It vibrates so that the floor remembers every stroke. That's why they worked at night, when the city itself makes noise, when the rumble of wheels, shouts from pubs, and the clatter of horses' hooves blend into one background. The press was hidden under blankets, under sacks, under layers of rags, and still every sound made you freeze. Because if a neighbor hears, he might not say anything, or maybe he might say everything. The paper was the cheapest you could find, yellow, rough, often with stains. They saved on ink. The drawings were made sharp, contrasting, not for beauty, for speed. The illustrations were carved on wood or metal. Their hands were constantly covered in ink. Their fingers were cracked. Their nails were dark, like evidence that cannot be washed away. These people did not read what they printed, not because they did not want to, but because they could not afford to know. Because knowledge is participation, and participation is a sentence. There was no hierarchy in underground printing. There was only a link. One cuts the cliché. The second turns the machine. The third dries the letters. The fourth disappears with them into the night. No one knows the names. No one asks where you are from, because questions are the path to betrayal. And if someone is taken away, the link simply disappears. No goodbyes, no explanations. The next night, another one takes his place. The police knew about it. The reports of the time say in black and white, the hardest thing is not finding the material. The hardest thing is proving who printed it. So they waited. Not for the machine, not for the salesman, but for a mistake. One sheet of paper that fell out of the pocket. One customer who spoke too much. One night when someone didn't have time to destroy the matrix. And then, a raid. When the police burst into the premises, the first thing that flew was not the paper. The fates flew. The machines were broken. The matrices were confiscated. Names appeared on the lists. But the most terrible thing, often the ones who were arrested were not those who earned the most, but those who simply happened to be nearby. Student, relative, neighbor, people who didn't even know that they were working in crime. There is no safe role in this story. The printer risks every night. The carrier risks on the road. The buyer risks afterwards. And between them, paper, silent, inanimate. And it is he who connects everyone into a chain that can only be broken by arrest or fear. And now remember this feeling, the dull thud of the machine, the smell of ink, the darkness in which you don't know whether this night is a work night. Because in the next chapter, we will go where these papers come out, where a mistake ceases to be abstract, and where one wrong move is not paid for with money. Sell so you don't die. There comes a point when paper stops being the printer's problem and becomes everyone else's problem. That's the point of exit. The London black market had no space, no market, and no time. It existed in the gaps, between police shifts, between pub closings, between the last light and the first darkness. The sale never looked like a sale. No one stood with the goods, no one called out to customers, and no one lingered longer than necessary to be noticed. It all started with a look. Two people walk by. One looks longer than is customary. The other doesn't look away immediately. It's not consent, it's an inspection. The second look is a little lower, at the pocket, at the fold of the coat. If there is no answer, you simply part ways. If there is, you are already together, even if there are a few steps between you. The places changed constantly. Stairs to underground toilets, passages between warehouses, narrow corridors between buildings where you cannot hear footsteps. The best spots are where there is always an excuse nearby. A newspaper in your hand, a package, a conversation about the weather. Because if something goes wrong, you have to look like a random person. Money was not counted. You felt it. Coins weighed enough to know it was not a lie. The paper was handed over folded, always folded, because unfolding means showing, and showing means confirming. At that moment, you become not a buyer, but an owner. And this is where the real fear begins, because the seller can still disappear. The printer can run away. The middleman can change the district. And you can move on with what is now tied to you. Your pocket becomes heavy, not from weight, from significance. Every policeman is no longer just a uniform. Every shout is not just noise. Every sudden movement is a possible end. The police knew this. In the 1880s, they almost never caught sellers on the spot. It was too difficult, too risky. Instead, they caught them after. at the exit from the district, on bridges, near stations, where people relax. Sometimes they stopped at random. Sometimes they did it on a tip-off. Sometimes they just did it because someone looked wrong. The search was not delicate. Hands in pockets, coat unbuttoned, look cold. And if the paper was found, nothing else mattered. You could remain silent. You could explain. You could cry. The paper spoke for you. But that wasn't the most dangerous thing. The most dangerous thing was to return home. Because if you weren't stopped on the street, it didn't mean that you weren't being followed. Many reports of that time contain the same phrase. The arrest was made the next day. Not on the spot. Not right away. And then, when a person already believed that everything was over. In this survival system, there was no end. There was no moment when you could exhale. The paper didn't disappear, even when it was burned, because the memory remained, and the lists were kept. And in the next section, we will talk about those who never traded, never printed, but still got hit. Those who didn't intend. In Victorian London, you didn't have to be a criminal to be punished as a criminal. You just had to be there. One of the biggest mistakes is to think that underground printing was a small group of people. In fact, it involved people who didn't even know they were involved. The owner of the room you rented, the printer's wife, the child who brought the package, the neighbor who let you use the stairs. They were all links without choice. In the 1880s, the law wasn't much interested in motivation. It was interested in the fact of presence, the fact of access, the fact of silence. If you were found to have illicit printing in your home, you became part of the case, not a witness, not a victim, but an accomplice. There are documented cases where women were arrested not for selling or even for possessing, but for not asking questions. Did you know your husband worked at night? Did you see these papers? Why didn't you tell him? And any answer worked against you, because yes meant knowledge, no meant lying. Young people were especially vulnerable. Printers' apprentices, messengers, guys who were just looking for work. They weren't told what they were carrying. They were paid a pittance, and they were told not to look inside. But when the police found the package, neither age nor ignorance mattered. Judges called it moral hazard. Sometimes the case didn't even reach court. The person was detained. The name appeared in the register. Employers found out. Landlords did too. Even if the charges were dropped, the stain remained. In a city where everyone depends on reputation, it was almost a sentence. But the cruelest thing was something else. Underground printing was often found not during searches, but during domestic tragedies. Fire, sudden death, illness. The police came for one reason and found something that turned grief into a case. And then even death didn't stop the accusations. In the reports of that time, there are dry lines. Materials seized, premises sealed, family evicted. No details, no names. But behind every line are people who woke up one morning and realized that their lives were no longer theirs. That's why the fear was constant. Not because you were doing anything wrong, but because you might not have known it. In this survival system, intentions didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was whether or not you were on the paper trail. In the next chapter, we'll see the moment when this shadowy system came to light, when one case became too loud to hide, and when the state decided it was time to show force. When the state enters the room. At some point, even the quietest things become too loud. The London underground press did not collapse because of greed, and it was not because of the mistake of one salesman. It attracted attention because it became visible. It all began with a single raid, which was not planned as a demonstration, a routine check. One of many evenings when the police were looking for immoral materials in a particular area. But this time, they found too much. Not a few sheets, not a package, but an entire room. A machine, matrices, lists, and, worst of all, the names of clients. The news spread quickly. The newspapers that condemned the underground press by day were feeding on it by night. The headlines were cautious, but the meaning was clear. A dangerous network. The capital's moral threat. Secret files among respectable citizens. And suddenly it became clear. This was no longer a story about the poor neighborhoods. This was a story about everyone. Cases began to be combined. Names were checked. Addresses were visited. The police no longer hid in the shadows. They came during the day. Doors were opened without explanation. Drawers were opened without permission. Neighbors were watching without shame. Because when the state decides to show force, it does so publicly. For many people, it was the first time that they understood that underground paper was never a small matter. It could not simply be thrown or burned, because now there were lists, testimony, stories. Even those who were not arrested became suspects forever. The courtrooms were filled with spectators, not for sympathy, for example. The judges talked about morality. The prosecutors talked about the threat to society. The newspapers talked about purification. And the defendants stood silent, because there was nothing to explain. The paper had already said it all. The most terrible thing about this wave was that it had no clear end. There was no moment when you could say, "It's safe now," because each new arrest created new threads. Each thread led to someone else. And that's where the system began to eat itself. People stopped trusting. They stopped being silent. They stopped helping. Someone started speaking first. Someone to save themselves. Someone to take revenge. And the shadow market, which had been kept silent, began to crack. But this was not the end, because every pressure begets a bypass. And in the next chapter, we will see how the underground printing did not disappear. It changed form. It became quieter, more dangerous, and much closer to those who considered themselves safe. When silence becomes a method. After the raids, it seemed that the danger had passed. The presses were destroyed. The salesmen were gone. The names in the newspapers had disappeared from the pages. The city was dying. And at that very moment, the system returned. Underground printing did not die. It had dissolved. There were no more rooms full of paper. There were no more customer lists. There were no more mass sales. Now there was only one rule. Less means safer. One sheet, one buyer, one night. New materials were not stored. They were handed over and destroyed immediately. Read it and burned it. Looked at it and threw it in the Thames. Delayed and you risked it. People learned not to leave a trace. And this made the system almost invisible. The sellers also changed. They were no longer people from the street, and not middlemen. Now the paper appeared where it was not expected: in houses with servants, in clubs, in private rooms, where the police did not enter. The paper was handed over with an invitation, or as a chance find, or as a debt. You never asked directly, and you never received openly. The police felt it. There were fewer reports. There were almost no confiscations. But the rumors did not disappear. They simply changed direction. Now the suspicion was not on the poor, but on those who could afford to remain silent. And this is where the danger became different. Before, the risk was in action. Now, in reputation. A hint was enough. A look. A stranger's word. And people began to disappear from receptions, from positions, from the circle of trust, without arrests, without convictions, but with consequences. The worst thing is you never knew who was nearby: the seller, the buyer, or the one who was collecting information. Silence was no longer safe. It became a tool, because silence is the perfect cover for betrayal. In this phase of survival, people began to betray not out of fear, but out of caution. Some spoke to protect themselves, some to eliminate a competitor, some simply to get out of the game. And every word made the network even less predictable. Paper was no longer the center of history. It became a pretext for suspicion, for manipulation, for destroying someone else's life without any proof. And that was the moment when underground printing ceased to be just a story about materials. It became a story about power over fear. In the next chapter, we will see what happens when even those who created the system stop controlling it, and when survival begins to demand not silence, but sacrifice. When fear demands sacrifice. Every shadow system is based on one thing: someone must remain silent. But silence is a limited resource. At some point, a new type of person emerges in London. She is not a printer, she is not a seller, and not a buyer. She is the one who knows too much. These people were inside the network, not for long, and that was enough. They saw names, addresses, routes, and one day they realized there was only one way out. The police didn't call it cooperation. They called it providing information in the public interest. For the person on the other side of the table, it meant a simple deal: names in exchange for silence, addresses in exchange for freedom, testimony in exchange for a chance not to be next. The problem was something else. The system had no stopping mechanism. One victim was not saved. It was postponed. Because after the first denunciation, the fear does not disappear. It intensifies. People began to guess. Behavior changed. Meetings became shorter. Names stopped being mentioned. And when someone disappeared, no one asked why, because the answer was obvious. There were cases when a person was not arrested. She simply ceased to be part of the city. She was not welcomed. She was not answered. She was not hired. It was a silent form of punishment, without a sentence, without the press, but with the same result. The worst thing is that often the victims were those who were least guilty: the intermediaries, accidental carriers, people who are easy to replace. because the system always protects the center and gives away the periphery. There are cases in the police archives that are cut off suddenly, without a verdict, without an explanation. Just a note, no longer of interest. This meant one thing. The person had done their job, and now it was their turn to disappear from history. This stage was the most dangerous, because here, survival required not caution, but the sacrifices of others. And the longer you stayed in the game, the greater the likelihood that someday someone would call your name. In the next chapter, we will reach the moment when even the state understood that this fear could no longer be controlled, and when the attempt to stop underground printing began to destroy what it was supposed to protect. When control gets out of control. At first, it looked like a success. Fewer raids, fewer high-profile cases, fewer headlines. The shadow seemed to recede. But deep down, something else began to happen. The London police force of the late 19th century was a machine running on reports. The number of seizures, the number of cases, the number of hits. And when the underground press became almost invisible, the machine did not stop. It began to look for a replacement. The bar of suspicion was lowered. What had previously been considered hearsay now became pretext. An anonymous letter, a hint from a neighbor, an uncomfortable reputation. All of this began to turn into cases, not because there was enough evidence, and because results were needed. Mistakes appeared, searches without findings, arrests without confirmation, accusations that crumbled in court, and each such case hit credibility, not to the underground, but to those who were supposed to stop them. The newspapers felt it first. The same publications that had recently supported the raids now cautiously changed their tone. Instead of cleansing, questions. Instead of morality, doubts. Because when the state begins to punish without clear boundaries, fear goes the other way. A new feeling appears in society. The danger is not only in paper. The danger is in the system that can make mistakes and not stop. People begin to fear not arrest, but arbitrariness. And here is where the paradox occurs. The harder the state presses, the more people begin to sympathize with those who were condemned yesterday. Not because they approve of underground printing, but because they recognize vulnerability. This does not mean the victory of the shadow market, and it does not mean the defeat of the law. It means that the line has been erased, and when the line is gone, survival once again becomes a matter of chance. At this moment, many people understood the question is no longer whether the paper is banned. The question is, who is next? Because if today they are under suspicion, then tomorrow it could be anyone. Those who just read. Not everyone in this story wanted more. Most wanted less. Less noise, less fear, less attention. They just read. In the 1880s, the reader of the underground print rarely looked like a criminal. They might have been clerks, teachers, craftsmen, people with fixed schedules and clear habits. They didn't walk dark alleys every day. They didn't know names. They didn't participate in broadcasts. And that's why they were the most vulnerable. Reading was a solitary act. The door was closed. The window was curtained. The candle was placed lower than usual. The paper was unrolled slowly, not out of curiosity, out of fear of the sound, because every rustle seemed louder than a scream. Nobody read for long, not because they didn't want to, but because long reading meant the risk of attachment. You couldn't put the paper on the shelf. You couldn't save it for later. It was either destroyed or it destroyed you. And yet there were those who didn't burn it right away. Some wanted to return it. Some wanted to show it to someone else. Some simply didn't dare. It was with them that the worst happened. The police rarely found the paper during routine checks. They found it during accidents. A broken pipe, a noise complaint, a fire in the next room. And then, under the mattress, in a drawer, among the linen, evidence would appear. Not of a crime of intent, but of a crime of fact. After that, life never returned, even if the case was closed, even if the court did not find a warehouse. The person became the one from whom they were found. That was enough. The most painful thing was that readers had no safety net. Sellers disappeared. Printers were silent. Intermediaries did not respond. And the reader was left alone. And when the system began to falter, he was the first to fall. In the diaries of that time, there are entries that do not speak of a crime. They speak of sleep, about sleepless nights, about dreams where someone is knocking, about the fear of opening the door even during the day, because paper can burn, but memory does not. In the next chapter, we will come to the final phase, to where the state draws conclusions, where underground printing changes its face, and where it becomes clear this story is not over. It has moved on. When the rules change, but the danger doesn't. In the late 1880s, a new word appeared in London. It wasn't written in the headlines, but it was increasingly heard in the corridors of power. Reform. Officially, the state began to admit that pressure methods had gone too far. Cases were lost in court. Newspapers were asking uncomfortable questions. Public opinion was wavering. And the law was beginning to soften its wording. Fewer high-profile raids, more procedures, more paperwork. On paper, it looked like the end of an era. But for the people on the streets, nothing changed instantly. A policeman could still stop. A search was still possible. Suspicion had not disappeared. Because systems couldn't shut down abruptly. Underground printing is more responsive. It is now almost non-existent in physical form. Fewer illustrations, less paper, more word of mouth. What was once a sheet of paper becomes a rumor, a description, a hint. And that makes control almost impossible. For former market participants, this means a strange feeling. The danger has diminished, but the fear remains. Because they know the rules can change again, and not always in their favor. A new tone emerges in the diaries of the end of the decade. Less panic, more fatigue. People do not rejoice in freedom. They are getting used to instability. Because the real lesson of this story is not that prohibition has disappeared, but in how easily it can return. And it is here that it becomes clear. This story is not about paper. It is about how society learns to live with control, and how control is never temporary for those who experience it. Who really survived? When the noise dies down, a question remains that people don't like to ask out loud. Who came out of this story alive? On paper, the answer is simple. Those who weren't arrested, those who weren't listed. those whose names didn't appear in the newspapers. But life is never reduced to paper. The printers survived, who managed to disappear in time, changed the city, changed the job, changed the name. The salesman survived, who sold the last sheet and never came back. Even some readers survived, who burned the paper and fell silent forever. But survival is not the same as liberation, because fear is not measured by sentences. It is measured by how people start to live differently. Don't look them in the eye. Don't trust words. Don't keep anything unnecessary. It settles into habits. For many, London in the 1890s became a quieter city. Less conversation, fewer casual acquaintances, less risk, even where there was none. Because the memory of paper taught the main thing. Not everything that can be had is worth having. The state also survived. It didn't break. It didn't retreat completely. It pretended to find balance. But each subsequent crisis showed the same thing. The mechanisms of control never disappear. They wait. And when, years later, new prohibitions, new lists, new moral threats, those who remembered the 1880s recognized a familiar feeling. Not panic, not shock. Prudence. That's why the real survivors were not those who escaped punishment, but those who understood the price of possession, the price of knowledge, the price of curiosity, the price of a piece of paper that could one day make you dangerous without any action on your part. Could you survive this? Try to imagine that danger didn't look like danger. It didn't scream. It didn't run. It didn't hide in a dark alley. It lay quietly, folded, among other things. In 1880 London, survival rarely depended on strength. Sometimes it depended on whether you could refuse in time, not take, not look, not know. Because knowing is also a form of participation. These people didn't think of themselves as heroes, and they didn't think of themselves as criminals. They simply lived in a time where the line between curiosity and conviction was thinner than paper, and that line could appear at any moment. We like to think that things are different today, that we would recognize danger, that we would have had time to hide, that we would have made the right choice. But the story of 1880s London is not about wrong decisions. It is about that sometimes there is no right decision. Because how do you survive when possession itself can destroy you? How do you prove your innocence when proof is a fact of existence? How do you defend yourself when danger is quiet, legitimate, and certain of its own right? People back then didn't know they would become history. They didn't know someone would whisper their fear. They were just trying to make it through the morning. And now the question comes back to you, not as a spectator, but as a participant. If you lived in a city where one piece of paper could ruin your life, would you be able to give it up? Could you survive this? This is not a horror story. This is history.